A heated argument erupted outside the Community Health Center in Syracuse, New York, on June the 10th of 2020. According to police records, 44-year-old Chanel PriceGreen, a mother of 12, was among a group of people waiting outside the center, which was offering free COVID-19 testing. PriceGreen was asked to stand 6 feet away from the check-in desk, but in the process of maintaining social distance, she allegedly got too close to a pregnant woman in line, who was later identified as Fantasia Turan, aged 26. The two exchanged some choice words, and as tensions escalated, Turan called her boyfriend, 47-year-old Julius Brown, who arrived at the scene after about 10 minutes. Although what exactly transpired next wasn't made clear in initial reports, PriceGreen eventually needed to be transported to Upstate University Hospital with a midsection stab wound. The victim ultimately passed away from her injuries, and after a preliminary police investigation, both Turan and Brown were arrested on charges of second-degree murder and criminal possession of a weapon. Prior to the start of the trial in late 2022, Turan was offered a plea deal which would have led to her spending 5 years behind bars for PriceGreen's killing. The offer was declined, and following court proceedings in December, Turan was formally convicted of murder. She was consequently sentenced to 25 years in prison, the same punishment handed down to her partner. Number 7. Abigail Simon. In the spring of 2013, it emerged that a female tutor at Grand Rapids Central and West Catholic High School in Michigan had been having an inappropriate relationship with a teenage student. 35-year-old Abigail Simon was found to have exchanged over 1,000 text messages with the boy, many of them explicit in nature, and was also accused of having intimate relations with him. She was consequently arrested, but was offered a plea deal that would have brought a swift end to the criminal proceedings. Simon refused the offer, indicating she wanted to clear her name at trial. Following a probable cause hearing in August of 2013, the woman was offered yet another chance to receive a lighter sentence in exchange for pleading guilty to her charges, but turned it down. Then, at the culmination of the resulting 3-week trial, Simon was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree criminal conduct and 1 misdemeanor count of accosting a minor for immoral purposes. In January of 2015, she was sentenced to between 8 and 25 years behind bars. The judge decreed that Simon would need to undergo lifelong supervision and register as an offender after her eventual release. Under the terms of the plea bargain that Simon rejected, she would have only served a maximum of 2 years in prison. Number 6. Richard Bigo Barnett. During the attack on the U.S. Capitol building on January the 6th of 2021, some of the besiegers made their way into the offices of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. A stun gun-wielding man, later identified as 61-year-old Richard Bigo Barnett from Gravette, Arkansas, was photographed with his feet up on the polarizing politician's desk. The man reportedly left a profane handwritten note before making off with one of Pelosi's personalized envelopes. The picture swiftly made the rounds on social media, leading to Barnett, a window salesman and former firefighter, becoming one of the more recognizable faces from the infamous riot. With increased notoriety also came heightened attention from law enforcement, as Barnett was reportedly hit with several criminal charges in the insurrection's aftermath, including entering a restricted building with a dangerous weapon. Among the rest of his alleged offenses were counts of theft of government property, disorderly conduct, and obstruction of an official proceeding. In a pretrial hearing, Barnett's representation announced that he would be rejecting the prosecution's plea bargain, which contained sentencing guidelines of between 70 and 87 months behind bars. The defense team called the offer unreasonable, citing Barnett's previously clean record. The matter was therefore taken to trial in September of 2022. Following 8 days of rigorous proceedings in federal court, Barnett was found guilty of 8 criminal counts, facing a maximum penalty of 47 years in prison. Barnett's official sentencing was slated for May of 2023. Number 5. Lakeith Smith. In February of 2015, a group of 5 juveniles from Elmore County, Alabama, carried out a pair of armed home invasions in Millbrook in broad daylight. When police officers were dispatched to the second home, the burglary was still in progress, and they were met with gunfire from some of the teens. Law enforcement returned fire, leading to the death of Adonte Washington, who'd ran through the gate of a wooden privacy fence and rushed towards one of the officers. In body cam footage shown during the resulting criminal trial, it was revealed that Washington had been armed with a .38 caliber revolver when he charged the policeman. In the gunfight's aftermath, legal responsibility for Washington's death fell upon Lakeith Smith, the youngest of the group, who was only 15 years old when he took part in the deadly break-in. Smith was charged with murder under Alabama's accomplice laws. He was reportedly offered a plea bargain which would have sentenced him to 25 years in prison for his friend's death. However, Smith rejected the deal, choosing instead to take his case to trial and fight to prove his innocence. The teen's legal strategy ultimately proved unsuccessful, and a jury found him guilty of felony murder, burglary, and theft. Judge Sibley Reynolds of Alabama's 19th Judicial Circuit Court subsequently sentenced him to 30 years for murder, 15 years for burglary, and 10 years each for 2 theft convictions. The 65-year aggregate total exceeded the prison term offered in the rejected plea deal by 4 decades. Activists set up a Change.org campaign advocating for the young man's early release. As of March of 2023, more than 850,000 people had signed the online petition. Number 4. Ryan Hole. In the early hours of March the 10th of 2003, Florida man Ryan Hole lent his car to his friend and housemate William Allen Jr. after a night of partying. Hole relinquished the vehicle despite the fact that Allen and others had detailed plans to drive to the home of Christine Snyder, steal drugs and money, and then beat up Snyder's teenage daughter. Upon securing the car, Allen reportedly dropped 3 men off at Snyder's house. The trio subsequently broke in and removed a safe containing a pound of marijuana and $425 in cash. During the course of the home invasion, one of the men bludgeoned 18-year-old Jessica Snyder to death with a shotgun. Although Hole was a mile and a half away at the time of the deadly break-in, he nevertheless faced legal repercussions in the aftermath. Under the felony murder rule, prosecutors are able to broaden murder liability for participants in violent felonies to include a killing by an accomplice. Hole was described as an accomplice given that the murder had been facilitated in part by him willingly allowing the perpetrators to utilize his vehicle. Of the 5 defendants allegedly involved, Hole was the only one offered a plea deal, which would have resulted in a prison sentence of 10 years. The man rejected the offer, and after being found guilty of murder at trial, was sentenced to life without parole. In 2015, Hole's prison term was reduced to 25 years by then Florida Governor Rick Scott. Number 3. Reginald Jones. On September the 12th of 2016, New Orleans police were called to the scene of a dispute between neighbors in the 2500 block of Elder Street. According to official documents, Reginald Jones, a man in his early 50s, had brandished a firearm during an argument with his 63-year-old neighbor. The latter told officers that Jones followed him into his yard and threatened him with the gun, which was corroborated by footage taken from his home security cameras. Jones, meanwhile, claimed that the weapon was just a water gun, which he'd allegedly broken into pieces that he then discarded in the Peoples Avenue Canal. Authorities didn't believe him, and he was taken into custody on charges of aggravated assault with a firearm, illegal possession of a firearm by a felon, and obstruction of justice. In November of 2017, Jones agreed to a deal with the state, which had him plead guilty to aggravated assault in exchange for a 5-year prison sentence. Over the next 2 months, however, the man made vociferous attempts to withdraw his plea by appealing to the Louisiana Supreme Court. He also reportedly filed a motion in Orleans Parish Criminal District Court to nullify the plea bargain due to abandonment of counsel and ineffectiveness of legal representation by Orleans Parish public defenders. After securing a new attorney, Jones officially withdrew his plea and the case was brought to the courtroom. After being found guilty during a trial that lasted only 1 day, the man was offered yet another deal which would have seen him serve 15 years behind bars. Jones said no once again, and in the summer of 2018, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Number 2. Anna Sorokin. Notorious Russian fraudster Anna Sorokin was offered a plea deal following her arrest in 2017, but she turned it down, instead opting to take her case to trial. Sorokin exploded on the New York City scene in 2013 when she conceived of a private members club, an arts foundation that would cater to notable artists, including ones she'd met while interning for the French fashion magazine Purple. To make herself more appealing to society's upper crust, the woman falsely claimed to be a German heiress with many millions of dollars to her name, a deception she maintained by forging financial documents and checks. It's been estimated that Sorokin built various people, banks, hotels, and major financial institutions out of a total of $275,000 before her scheme was finally uncovered. Investigators relied on the cooperation of Sorokin's former friend, Rachel DeLoach Williams, who'd lost over $60,000 as a consequence of the extensive fraud. Williams aided the NYPD in a sting operation that ultimately landed Sorokin in handcuffs on charges of attempted grand larceny, second-degree larceny, and theft of services. In December of 2018, the con artist was offered a deal by the prosecution, the terms of which stipulated that she would serve between 3 and 9 years behind bars for her crimes. Sorokin rejected the bargain and then was convicted of her charges during the criminal trial that took place the following March. She was sentenced to a prison term of 4 to 12 years, a slightly elevated punishment in comparison to the deal she was offered. Sorokin still ended up earning supervised release 2 years later, but was then taken back into custody by immigration officials for overstaying her visa. In October of 2022, Sorokin was released again after securing a $10,000 bail bond, but was ordered to remain on 24-hour house arrest with no access to social media. Before number 1, and just in case you're feeling like you're only just getting warmed up, you can stay tuned after if you'd like and watch our earlier release on When the Justice System Goes Wrong. Number 1. Raymond Lindsay Jr. Houston police officers were dispatched to an apartment complex in southeast Montgomery County for a possible domestic disturbance on January the 5th of 2015. Upon arrival, law enforcement encountered Raymond Lindsay Jr. and his girlfriend, who appeared to be fearful of him. As the woman gathered her things to leave the apartment, Lindsay allegedly pointed his finger at the responding officers one by one and threatened to kill them individually. The man then flew into a destructive rage, smashing various items around the house, including a glass table, a television set, and a cage containing a live bird. At that point, backup officers arrived at the scene to assist in taking Lindsay into custody. As they did so, however, the man proceeded to attack them, slamming the apartment door on one of the officers' arms repeatedly before finally being subdued. In the late summer of the following year, after Lindsay had already been held behind bars for 19 months, he was offered a plea deal that would see him released with time served. Although Lindsay indicated he was appreciative of the prosecution's offer, he declined it, as he reportedly did not want to plead guilty. He also expressed his belief that everyone was conspiring against him. Although Lindsay had a documented history of mental illness, he was deemed competent to stand trial following a mental health evaluation. He was ultimately convicted of assault on a public servant and retaliation, for which he received a prison sentence of 40 years. His punishment had been worsened because of his lengthy criminal record, which included prior convictions for burglary, unlawful possession of a vehicle, domestic assault, and family violence. Number 5. Kirsten Lopato. In May of 2001, 18-year-old Kirsten Lopato of Panaca, Nevada, took a trip to Las Vegas to visit some friends. What she'd expected to be a relaxing outing to Sin City would ultimately result in her going to prison for a crime in which she hadn't been involved. The chain of events began to unfold when she was accosted in the parking lot of her hotel. Lopato used a knife to fend off the attacker, slashing in the area of his groin, which in turn made him flee the scene. She was shaken but safe, and later told friends and family about the incident. 2 months later, after Lopato had already returned home to Panaca, Las Vegas police discovered the dead body of a man named Duran Bailey in the parking lot of a bank. He had suffered injuries that were consistent with Lopato's story, which they received a tip about a couple of weeks later. After falsely connecting the two incidents, Lopato was arrested for Bailey's murder and found guilty in 2002 after she'd failed to come up with a concrete alibi for the night of his death. She spent 16 years behind bars, all because she'd chosen to defend herself on that fateful summer night. Though her initial conviction was thrown out in 2004, she was tried again in 2006 and convicted of manslaughter, mutilation, and weapons charges. Lopato reached out to the Innocence Project in the hope that they might get her case re-examined. In 2016, the Nevada Supreme Court granted her wish, this time with the help of forensic entomologists brought in by the Innocence Project. The defense was able to prove that Bailey had been dead since 10 p.m., the night before his body was discovered. Lopato had solid alibis for that specific window of time, so she was acquitted of the charges that had kept her in jail for nearly 2 decades. She's presently focused on moving on with her life, having had most of her prime years taken away simply because the Las Vegas Police Department had failed to do their due diligence during the initial investigation. Number 4. Walter Forbes. In 1982, Michigan man Walter Forbes was taken to court over an apartment fire that resulted in the death of a man named Dennis Hall. Forbes was not a violent man, nor did he possess a criminal background of any kind. He did, however, have a history with the victim himself. Forbes had previously broken up a bar fight between Hall and another man. This incident led to Forbes being shot by Hall just a day later, so the prosecution had fairly obvious grounds to conjure a possible motive during the court proceedings. The case against Forbes eventually hinged on the testimony of a 19-year-old single mother named Anise Kennebrew, who claimed to have witnessed him igniting the blaze that ultimately killed Hall. Forbes was subsequently sent to prison, where he was housed for 38 years, being punished for a murder he didn't commit. Just as his conviction rested heavily on Kennebrew's original statement in court, so too would his eventual liberation. On June the 8th of 2020, Kennebrew decided to recant her testimony, admitting that it was all a fictitious statement. She claimed to have been threatened by 2 men leading up to Forbes' trial, and that if she hadn't testified against him, they'd come after her. After getting diagnosed with cancer nearly 40 years later, Kennebrew wanted to get the burden of the lie off her chest while she still had the chance. Forbes had worked with the Michigan Innocence Clinic for 10 years before he was ultimately released. He became a free man in 2020 and claimed to have forgiven everyone involved in his wrongful conviction, including Anise Kennebrew, the woman who'd been pressured into telling a lie that sent him to jail for the majority of his life. Number 3. Jimmy Dennis. 22-year-old Jimmy Dennis was on the verge of achieving success on Philadelphia's music scene. He had always aspired to become a professional musician, and those dreams were well within reach in the early 90s. In the blink of an eye, however, Dennis's plans for the future would enter an irreparable downward spiral. He was arrested for the murder of 17-year-old Chadell Williams, who was shot dead following an attempted robbery. Even though there wasn't even a single piece of physical evidence tying Dennis to Williams' death, he was found guilty of her murder by a jury of his peers and was subsequently given the death penalty. People would later scrutinize the job done by Dennis's defense lawyer, whose shortcomings in court would result in his client spending 25 years behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, and very nearly cost him his life. Dennis's execution was set 2 different times over the course of the quarter century he served, but fortunately for him, they were both eventually rescheduled. Dennis's willpower was unwavering. He maintained his innocence throughout the entirety of his prison term and even refused to pick a last meal as his execution dates drew near. His resilience was finally rewarded in August of 2016 when the Third Circuit Court of Appeals granted a reversal of the 1992 ruling that had placed an innocent man on death row for nearly 9,000 days. While in jail, Jimmy continued to work on his music, which he credited with helping maintain his sanity throughout his ordeal. Even though he was finally free, the mental toll that the prolonged incarceration had taken on Dennis was tremendous. He continued to suffer from crippling anxiety and paranoia, fearing that he might one day find himself back in jail, even if he'd done nothing wrong. Today's topic was requested by KPG Doxy Ma, Miss Pratt, and Christine Keeler. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Francis Choi. In April of 2003, the Choi family of Brockton, Massachusetts, watched their home go up in flames. The house fire engulfed much of the property and in the end resulted in the deaths of 53-year-old Anne and Jimmy, aged 64. Following a police investigation, it was determined that someone had started the fire on purpose. As the hunt for the arsonist responsible began, the prime suspect became Frances, the 17-year-old daughter of the two victims. She had been rescued from the blaze by firefighters, along with her 16-year-old nephew, Kenneth. Police soon took Frances into custody on charges of murdering her parents. She would spend the next 17 years of her life behind bars, with the knowledge that she was innocent of the crime for which she was being punished. To the rest of the world, unfortunately, she was known as a killer. Even though the first of her trials resulted in a hung jury, she was ultimately convicted of the murders in May of 2011. The judge handed down 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole. As the years ticked away, Frances began to lose hope of ever seeing the light of day again. However, she started working with an attorney from the Boston College Innocence Program, an initiative designed to help exonerate those falsely convicted of a crime. With the help of her new lawyers, she was able to get back inside a courtroom after the discovery of fresh evidence that would prove vital to the retrial. As it turned out, Kenneth had written a pair of notes detailing how to ignite a house fire in the weeks leading up to the blaze that killed the Chois. In the initial trial, Kenneth claimed it was Frances who'd instructed him to write those notes, and he was acquitted of the killings. In 2008, a major oversight was that his clothes had not been tested by the authorities for gasoline the first time around. Over the course of the retrial, Frances's clothes were retested and found to be completely devoid of any gasoline residue. The same could not be said for Kenneth, who'd fled to Hong Kong. Upon hearing news that the case was reopened, Frances's sentence was erased, and she was finally freed from her wrongful imprisonment. One of the more eye-opening revelations of the retrial was the discovery of racist and sexist emails sent between the prosecuting attorneys during Frances's first trials. They held a significant personal bias against her simply because she was an Asian female, an aspect that could very well have played a part in her initial conviction. While in prison, Frances earned her bachelor's degree and was eager to restart her life following her exoneration. Even so, she'd never get back those 17 years spent in jail, years that were stolen from an innocent teenager. Number 1. Amanda Knox. 20-year-old Amanda Knox was an exchange student living in Italy in 2007. She was taking advantage of the University of Washington's study abroad program and shared an apartment with a fellow exchange student named Meredith Kircher. After spending the night with her boyfriend, Rafael Solicito, Knox returned home to find blood all over the bathroom. She went to ask Kircher about it, but her bedroom door was locked and she was not responding from inside. Knox immediately called the police, who discovered Kircher's dead body in the room. In the investigation that followed, Knox did her best to aid the Italian authorities in their efforts to track down Kircher's killer. While being interviewed at the police station, Knox told officers that she had received a text that night from Patrick Lumumba, her boss at the restaurant where she worked, saying she didn't have to come into work. Knox subsequently went to Solicito's house and didn't return to the apartment she shared with Kircher until the morning her body was found. Knox maintained this original sequence of events throughout the investigation. Despite her solid alibi, Knox was being portrayed negatively in the Italian media, and the investigating officers were consistently hostile and accusatory towards her during their interactions. After hours and hours of psychological pressure and, to some degree, manipulation, the police forced Amanda into implicating herself, her boyfriend, and her boss in Kircher's murder. They were all arrested, though Lumumba was eventually released. Knox was sentenced to 26 years behind bars, while Solicito faced 25 years himself. Meanwhile, a man named Rudy Guede was found guilty on the charge of murdering Meredith Kircher after his bloody fingerprints were discovered in the apartment. Guede had been in jail just days before the killing, serving time for burglarizing a nursery school in Milan while wielding an 11-inch long kitchen knife. American forensic experts publicly contested Knox's conviction by Italian prosecutors, saying the evidence at the scene of the crime simply didn't support the notion that she was involved in any way. After 4 years spent in an Italian prison, both Knox and Solicito were granted their rightful freedom in 2011, though it wasn't until March of 2015 that they were officially exonerated of all charges. The memoir Amanda wrote, documenting her harrowing experiences, became an international bestseller, and she now hosts a show on Facebook, Watch, that's centered on stories of women who were publicly shamed. She uses the character assassination she had faced at the hands of the Italian mainstream media to inform her perspective on the subjects of her program. Thanks for watching. If you were falsely accused of a crime, would you take a plea deal to avoid harsh punishment or maintain your innocence and go to trial? Let us know in the comments section below.